Welcome to Human Monsters. In this episode, we explore the never-ending saga of violence against women, a problem that has not expired with the passing centuries. Part 1. French serial killer Martin Dumollard. Martin Dumollard was born on June 22, 1810, in Tramoy, France. Hostility, homicide, and death came to Martin's life early. He had a brother named Raymond, who died as a child. Though Richard and his family were consoled by the people of their village, those same people would come to address Martin by his brother's name, which he resented. He had a reputation for getting into fistfights, and this did nothing to alleviate his short temper, leading to more fights. Needless to say, he emerged in adulthood with a chip nailed securely to his shoulder. His father was an expat Hungarian with a criminal record. He had attempted to assassinate the King of Hungary. He fled Hungary because he was on the run. When the Austro-Hungarian military arrived in the French province of Ain in 1814, the family fled to the Italian city of Padua. The army arrived in that city about the same time, and his father was recognized by them, since a painting of him had been disseminated widely to authorities. He was arrested and sentenced to be executed by dismemberment. Martin and his mother witnessed his father's execution. A common method in those days involved horses was used. A rope was tied to each of his father's limbs, and then to one of 4 horses. The executioner fired a shot into the air, and it spooked the horses. The pain was unendurably excruciating for his father, but despite pulling his joints from their sockets, his limbs were not severed. The execution could not be left unfinished, so the executioner took up an axe for woodcutting and brought it down on Martin's father's head several times. Blood sprayed in all directions. He cut until bone and muscle were exposed. He watched as the executioner put his foot on his father's hip to pull apart the last threads of skin and tendon that held his leg precariously in position. As Martin's family screamed, the rest of the crowd cheered. The executioner continued to swing the axe until his father's head was severed entirely. His mother was inconsolable, even casting Martin aside as she was engulfed by horror and shock. With his father out of the picture, his family was destitute to the point of begging in the streets. What remained of the Dumollard family was banished from town. They decided to return to France. The trip was arduous, and they had no money for food. With Martin as the patriarch and his mother unable to provide, he underwent an apprenticeship in murder. With sticks, stones, and his bare hands, he killed rabbits to keep them fed. Along the way, they passed by the many casualties of war that lay dead after battles between the Austrian Empire and Napoleon's France. Martin pilfered whatever clothing and valuables he could find on the dead, including rationed food. His family were eventually taken in as refugees by the French forces. His mother was unable to provide for the family, since she not only had no marketable skills, but she was still so destabilized by grief that she couldn't function outside of her role as mother, and even her efforts in this area were insufficient. By then, Martin didn't need his mother. He was still hunting rabbits with a sling and stones. He was sometimes observed eating them raw. His manners were coarse and primitive, but there was lots of work for a strapping young man like himself in rural France. One of his positions involved protecting sheep from predators. He seldomly interacted with other human beings, and when he did, it was only when it became unavoidable. Otherwise, he lived like a hermit in the hills. When he did walk among men, he often bore injuries he incurred during his clashes with predatory carnivores. He didn't seek medical attention and was unconcerned about the possibility of infection. Eventually, an injury made it difficult for him to work. He took to theft to make money and keep himself fed. By the time the police investigated the matter, he had left town. He made money doing odd jobs on farms and protecting sheep when the opportunities arose. He eventually became a farmhand at the castle of Choré. He was recommended by a dozen people he worked for over the years. During his time at the castle of Choré, a young woman named Marie-Anne Martinet took a shine to Martin. She worked as a maid at the castle. His social skills were subpar. He was perpetually dirty due to the nature of his work, and he often smelled rank. But what was undeniable about him was his rugged masculinity. They eventually fell in love and spent every spare moment together. She came from a more civilized, refined, and educated world and acted as an emissary of sorts for him. As a result, he was better able to navigate the social interactions that were second nature to Marie-Anne. After his mother lost her maternal instincts due to the trauma of watching her husband get dismembered, she was unable to fill that role in Martin's life. Marie-Anne stepped up and approached him with sensitivity and understanding, where it was sorely lacking, and he was exceedingly grateful. 2 years after this honeymoon period, Marie-Anne became restless. Her long-term aspirations had nothing to do with cleaning houses. She sought more prosperous circumstances, and she soon realized it would never happen at the side of Martin Dumollard. He was happy with the circumstances as they were. They were approaching the age of 30, and she was no longer content to proceed as she was. She wanted to get married, have a family, and own a home. She read him the riot act, propose marriage, or they would go their separate ways. Martin was reluctant to do so. The way he saw it, venturing beyond the little world in which he dwelled out in the sticks, meant that he would have to go back to begging and thievery just to survive. She took the tack of promising sexual benefits as a reward for marrying her. He finally caved, and they were married in a chapel on the estate where they worked. It was witnessed by their co-workers. When they left to start their new life, the master of the house noticed that some silverware had since been found to be missing. He didn't retaliate. He considered it a wedding gift to the couple. Martin and Marie-Anne assumed that the master of the house was likely in pursuit of them for the theft of the silverware, and they fled to Switzerland. They eventually settled in a small cottage where they consummated their union. Their financial prospects soon proved to be dismal. They were running out of savings and items they could sell. Both of them were limited in terms of skills, and what skills they did possess were not in demand where they were living. Eventually they were left with no alternative but to sell their house and most of the items contained therein, and moved to a town called Dagnau in France. He and his family had lived there at one time, and they remembered him well enough to call him Raymond. Aside from that vexing aspect of life in Dagnau, the couple were treated well by the locals. Martin still struggled to find work and establish financial security, and it was difficult for Anne-Marie to take. She withdrew her affections. Out of desperation, Martin took the road to Lyon and became a highwayman, robbing several of the men he encountered along the way. Even this pursuit did not yield enough money to support himself and Anne-Marie. One day he spotted a woman carrying a basket of eggs. She was easy prey. Martin struck her with a stick and fell down on her, pinning her to the ground. He knew she wouldn't have any money, and he was right. That wasn't what he was looking for anyway. He tore her clothes off, bonnet, dress, petticoat, and all. He dragged her to a spot off the road and left her in a thicket. He took her dress with him so he could sell it. Anne-Marie had been selling her clothes, so there was clearly a market. Sure enough, he sold the woman's dress that very day and brought home a handsome payoff to Anne-Marie. He was pleased that he was able to luxuriate in her loving touch once more. He felt ashamed when it came time to tell her how he came about the money, but she didn't shame him or retaliate. She was aware of the dearth of job opportunities that afflicted the poor and unemployed in the area, and she knew that sometimes people turn to drastic measures in times of desperation. In fact, not only did she not admonish him for committing armed robbery, but she gave him pointers on how to commit the act more effectively. She advised him to avoid being seen because they would assume she had had a sexual encounter. If she were unmarried, they would shame her for it, and so she would more than likely leave the crime unreported. Martin would not have figured this out on his own. Marie-Anne was smarter and more inclined to consider the future consequences of his actions. Martin was only inclined to focus on the present. Anne-Marie became his mentor in malfeasance, advising him in the many ways in which he could make money committing robbery while avoiding prosecution. Martin Dumollard's next victim was Marie Badet. She was similar to Marie-Anne in that she had worked as a maid in a wealthy man's home and had grown tired of the arrangement. She had been fired and was evicted from the room she was renting. She was vulnerable in every way, as she was now homeless and jobless, not to mention estranged from her family. A man who had been waiting outside the house where she had been renting a room assisted her in packing up her possessions. He put them all into a traveling chest and carried it by himself. They walked out the city gates without looking back. Marie's landlady was the last person to see her alive. Several weeks later, a posse of hunters looking for deer in the forest of Montauvergne in Tramoy found Marie's corpse. All the men except one, who remained at the site to ward off scavengers, went to town to summon a magistrate. Scattered around her body were a handkerchief, a collar, a black lace cap, and a pair of shoes, all splotched with blood. Magistrate Genot, writing in the parlance of the times, noted that a, quote, gross outrage had been visited upon the girl. By gross outrage, he meant rape or aggravated rape. She was bludgeoned 6 times. Other wounds were made after she was rendered unconscious, and her clothing was removed. Genot opined that the first blow was made to the back of her head. He presumed that rape was the objective of the attack. This was inaccurate. Dumollard did take advantage of her, but he saw it as more of a fringe benefit. It was her dress he wanted. Marie Badet's remains were only identified months later when her family had a look at a post-mortem photograph that was disseminated from town to town. Suspects were sought, but with no confirmation of culpability. Martin Dumollard was free to kill again. Onward to the city of Lyon. Martin Dumollard approached Marie K. and proposed an offer of employment. She was already working, but she offered to introduce Martin to a friend who was looking for work. Her name was Olympe Alobert, and the rate of pay was too good for her to pass up. He offered her a position as a domestic worker at a lavish estate, like the kind where he met Marie-Anne. He carried her possessions as they made their way toward the forest of Montauvergne. Olympe heard about the girl who was murdered and left for dead in the forest. Martin Dumollard was leading her in the direction of a forest. She persuaded him that she was not able to travel through a forest in the dark, and that they must find a farmhouse in which to seek shelter. He tried to dissuade her from it, telling her that their destination was not far off. However, he had told her earlier where her future place of employment would be, so he would have been caught in a lie, had he fudged the truth. Olympe's gut instincts served her well, and she bolted. Martin dropped her belongings and grabbed a large rock. Before she could get far, he threw the rock at her. It hit her in the back, knocking the wind out of her. She stumbled as she struggled to choke some air back into her lungs. She turned back to the road just in time to feel another rock whiz past her ear. She felt a breeze as it missed her ear by millimeters. She ran to the road and ran in search of civilization. She reached a farmhouse and knocked and shouted hysterically. The matriarch answered the door and allowed Olympe into the house. The family of the house stayed up all night with her, primed to confront Dumollard, should he have turned up. In those parts, people dealt with bandits all the time, and violence usually factored into the equation. In the morning, Olympe went to a police station and reported the incident. She also gave a detailed description of the attacker. The police were very keen on acquiring this information, since it occurred to them that he might be the same man who killed Marie Badet. One obstacle the police faced in prosecuting the offender's crimes was class barriers. If Marie Badet and Marie Carr had been the daughters of noblemen, no expense would have been spared to scour the country in search of the perpetrator. But there was little concern about the lives of domestic servants, whose lives were perceived as wasteful by the upper crust. Josephine Charlotte was yet another maid to cross paths with Martin Dumollard. She dwelled and worked in Lyon. Appropriately, she met Dumollard by the town guillotine. He told her he had work for her that would pay a better wage than she had been making. As usual, Martin carried her belongings for her and escorted her out of town. She was not intimidated or creeped out by Martin, though she was a little unsettled by his repeated queries about her current financial situation, with emphasis on how much money she had on her person. Eventually, she expressed a reluctance to travel at night. It was a dangerous area, especially for women, and she knew about the murder of Marie Badet, even if she knew nothing about Dumollard's involvement. She hoped these issues would arouse concern in him, but he was fearless. Martin didn't want to see her go, but he knew that if he objected, she would become suspicious. She promised to meet him back at the road at dawn. She found shelter at a farmhouse. October 30th, 1855. Martin Dumollard returned to Lyon looking for another victim. He approached Jeanne-Marie Bourgeois, who was looking for work. He offered to employ her in travaux at a generous rate of compensation, and she accepted almost immediately. They agreed to depart for the location the following morning. October 31st. As Jeanne-Marie and Martin left town, there was something artificial and glib about his conduct. It was as if he were behaving like a civilized human being by rote rather than as second nature. By the time they arrived in the region of Meilnay, she suspected something was afoot, and she panicked. She turned in every direction to find a place to flee. She spotted the monastery of Paulentin. She wasted no time, running to the building at her top speed. Unfortunately for Jeanne-Marie, she was no athlete. She exhausted her limited stores of energy and fell on her knees. Immediately after, she felt a pair of coarse and strong hands grab her and lift her to her feet. Fortunately for Jeanne-Marie, the man who seized her was a farmer named Benoit Berthellier. She told him the story of what had just happened to her, and he invited her into his house to keep safe. Berthellier gathered a posse of men who took it upon themselves to seek Martin Dumollard. He had escaped before this course of action was taken. Berthellier and his friends escorted Jeanne-Marie to Lyon and brought her straight to the magistrates. They took her statement. She was notified that a man named Jacques Verger was accused of committing the murders and that he was held in custody. She was asked to take a look at him to see if he was indeed the culprit. She did not recognize him. He was also released because his presence in jail was the perfect alibi for him when considering the likelihood that he could have committed the murders on the dates they were alleged to have occurred. Forget was released. Victorine Perrin met Martin Dumollard a month later. She was 22 years old and seeking work. As with the others, he carried her travel chest as they made their way out of town. She was a trusting girl who suspected nothing sketchy or threatening about Dumollard. She lost him in a crowd and went back to Lyon with all her worldly possessions in his hands. But she at least returned with her life. She gave a statement to one of the magistrates about the crime. Julie Fargier was destitute when she arrived in Lyon. She had become unemployed and was evicted from her home after becoming pregnant out of wedlock with the landlord's child. Dumollard offered her a job with compensation that was hard to pass up. The problem was, she was reluctant to trust this strange man off the street. She explained that she was pregnant out of wedlock, and he was not put off by that circumstance, as so many others would have been at that time in history. They left at dawn. After Julie and Martin passed the Siveroux commune, the sun set, and they were far from civilization. Though she had never been entirely at ease in his presence, he did nothing before this moment to indicate that he intended to do her harm. Suddenly she felt him grab her with an iron grip. He scratched at her womb. It really felt like he was trying to reach in and pull the baby out, with her guts trailing behind it. She was terrified and began to scream. He was startled and stepped back a few paces. Before she had time to run, he lunged at her. He grabbed onto her apron and tore it off. A pocket in the apron contained all the money she had to her name. He ran off with it. Minutes later, farmer Simon Mallet and his son Louis came to her aid. They carried her back to Siveroux. Julie and Louis departed the following morning to report what had happened to Julie to the magistrate. Many other women disappeared at that time, and their bodies were never found, so there was no way of knowing if Dumollard was responsible. December. Martin Dumollard was seen with a woman. A man named Jean-Pierre Chrétien saw the man carrying a travel chest. That evening the woman returned. She was bruised and had been bleeding. She told Chrétien that the man he saw made off with her possessions. Chrétien tried to find the man, but could not. Martin Dumollard had spent much of his life hiding and living in the woods, so he knew his way around a forest. Chrétien took her back to town the following day. April 1860. Martin Dumollard made his customary job offer to Louise Michel. She was taken in by his kindness and found it easy to trust him. At one point, Dumollard pulled the horse to a stop. He asked Louise to dismount for a moment. He was jovial in inflection as he informed her that if she did not give him all her money, he would kill her. She was stunned. He had been so friendly with her all day. He didn't like being kept waiting. He punched her so hard she fell to the ground. She got up and ran. If she had run along the road, he could have simply caught up with her. She ran into the fields, and he was in his 50s by now, so though he was strong, he didn't have her energy and stamina. Louise ran until she stumbled upon a farmhouse. She explained what happened to her, and the occupants took her back to the city. The crime was reported to the authorities, but they reacted with skepticism when his physical profile was described to them. They made him out to be an ogre out of a children's book of fables, and they assumed he was more the product of an overactive imagination than a verifiable suspect in the case. Martin Dumollard offered Marie Pichon a modest salary of 250 francs a year, and she was sold. He He was unfailingly polite throughout their commute to the countryside. At one point, Dumollard put down the travel chest and tied his shoelaces. When he stood, he held a lariat, which had been hidden under his pant leg. He wrapped it around her neck. His intention was to strangle her and leave her naked body to the wolves. She raised her arm at an opportune moment, and instead of choking her, he just planted her hand against her face. When he was no longer able to hoist her up, he dropped her to the ground. She ran until she was given refuge in a farmhouse. The house's patriarch, Monsieur Joly, left to report the incident to the Garde Champêtre in Dagneux. The details were all too familiar by this point. Officials put two and two together, realizing that the offender was the man named Raymond, who had moved back in the area. The date of his return and his activities suggested culpability. Officers of the law went to the Dumollard homestead and arrested both Martin and Marie-Anne. Most of the evidence the investigators needed to prosecute was found in the Dumollard house. There were piles of women's clothing all over the house, with some piling up to the ceiling. Some of them were soiled by blood. There were so many dresses, it was impossible for them to estimate their combined worth at first glance. Seeing all the bloodstains suggested that more than one woman had been killed. One pile of clothing was not just dirty, but torn and stained with blood. Many of these garments were damaged beyond repair. Jewelry and other valuables were found in copious volumes. While in custody, Martin Dumollard, who was never much of a talker, clammed up when questioned. Marie-Anne had lots to say, and all of it involved blaming Martin for the crimes. Magistrate Genot figured out that she was the mastermind of the crimes, and Martin was only tasked with doing the legwork. It occurred to Genot, taking into account the attitudes of French society at the time, that a jury would not likely hang a woman for crimes that were committed by her husband. He pursued charges as though Martin was the sole offender, and that Marie-Anne was unaware of her role as an accomplice. Relatives of the missing girls went to the Dumollard house to look over the gross of pilfered clothing to see if they could recognize items that belonged to their relation. Josephte, Charlotte's sister, Marie, had seen Josephte depart the city with Martin Dumollard. She was taken to his jail cell, where she positively identified him as the man who led her sister beyond the city's gates. It was highly unorthodox, but Magistrate Genot knew he would never find the bodies of the missing girls unless the one person in the world bearing that knowledge were to lead him and his colleagues to them. Therefore, Martin Dumollard was brought out of his jail cell and was brought by legal authorities to the forest where he left his victims. Genot didn't have to pry the information out of him. After being there for only a couple of minutes, Dumollard said, "I know where the body is, and I am ready to take you there." Dumollard took the officers through a long trek into the forest that was widely known as the Woods of the Dead, until he stopped at a patch of dirt. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance. He pointed at it and said nothing. The gesture said everything they needed to know. The crew dug for a few minutes into the shallow grave where one Marie Eulalie had been buried. Dumollard was led away so that the woman's sisters could confirm the identity of the body without being disturbed by Dumollard's presence. After Marie Eulalie's identity was confirmed, some of the locals, horrified by the crime, nailed a wooden cross at her first burial site that read, "Here Marie Eulalie Bousseau was murdered. February 25, 1861. De Profundis." The body was taken to Genot's offices so that it could be examined by a coroner. The coroner's findings regarding the violence that was visited upon Marie Eulalie by Martin Dumollard. He stripped her naked and raped her aggressively. After he depleted her of all her energy and capacity to fight back, he buried her alive. She died from suffocating on dirt. As before, Marie-Anne concocted her version of Martin's crimes in a way that spared her the possibility of being accused of abetting him, even as the blood-stained clothing of his victims piled to the ceiling in their house. Martin still revered her, and therefore did not refute her version of the story. For instance, she told Genot that 4 years prior to his arrest, Martin murdered a girl in the Mount Man woods and brought home a pair of gold earrings. The police still didn't suspect Marie-Anne of involvement in Martin's crimes after she led them to a spot in the woods where the girl was buried. Martin denied that he committed the murder. He insisted he had never even crossed paths with her. The coroner's findings. The girl was raped twice, once before the murder and a second time post-mortem. The girl was never identified. So far, 2 murders were confirmed as having been committed by Dumollard. A dozen assaults were also attributed to him. When it came time to answer for his crimes, Martin Dumollard made the following statement. Note how Marie-Anne is never mentioned or even alluded to. In December of 1853, 2 farmers met me in Lyon. Their manners and appearance won my confidence. They treated me to wine in a tavern, then invited me to take a stroll with them down by the water, where we wouldn't be overheard. They asked me a load of questions, and finally asked me to enter their service. When I asked them what the job was, they said, "The abduction of young women." I was to have 40 francs for every prize, and if I stayed with them 20 years, I was guaranteed 100,000 francs. That was too good an offer to be treated lightly. They gave me simple instructions. I was to look out for young females in search of work or housing, offer them first-rate wages, and conduct them beyond the town. I started work a week later on the Place de la Charité. My first attempt failed, but the second woman who listened to my story accepted the pretend situation and followed me out of town. At the end of the suburbs, my employers met me. I pretended to have forgotten something and told the girl these gentlemen were friends of mine, who'd promised to take her on to Néron for me. Once they were gone and out of sight, I waited around for 3 hours. When the men returned, they handed me a parcel, saying it was a present for my wife. Inside were a gown and chemise stained with blood. I recognized the dress of the woman I'd brought and demanded what had become of her. They said, "You won't be seeing her again." On the way home, I washed the clothes in the fountains at Néron and gave them to my wife, saying I bought them for her at Lyon. I never knew where they murdered the girl, but I think it must have been near the bridge du Bas. I think so because one day the next summer, while crossing that bridge, in their company, one of them said, "We have sent 2 bodies under this bridge already." This I understood to imply other murders before I got involved. Maybe 2 bodies were put in the Rhone before this girl. Maybe 2, including her. Nothing more happened until February 1855, when my friends met me at a wine shop and brought along a girl with a dark complexion. We walked together as far as the road leading from Héribel to Éamonage, which passed through the wood. Understanding what was about to happen next, I sat down, saying I would go no further. I was no murderer, even if I did take their money. They tried to persuade me to come with them, but I refused, and they set off alone with the girl. I waited 2 hours. I didn't hear anything or see anything, but I still felt like something was wrong. The men eventually returned alone, saying they'd left the girl at a farm. As they brought no clothes back with them, I believed their story. We parted and I returned home. Nothing happened for 2 years. during which I sometimes met with my two friends. In December 1858, I fell in with them on the Quai de Parache. They told me they had something on hand and asked if I'd come along. They left me for a moment, returning with a young girl. We started by rail for Montreal. It was dark when we arrived, and the men asked me to guide them to some secluded spot, indicating the wood of Choisy. I told them it was too close to the high road, and they might be seen or heard from there. It would be better to go on further. Presently we reached the edge of Montmagny Wood. That would do. Again they left me seated by the roadside when I refused to follow through on their plan. Soon I heard one loud scream about 300 yards into the forest. Then silence. In a few minutes the men returned, bringing a silver watch and some clothes. I told them I had heard a scream and asked if she had suffered much. No, they answered. We gave her one hit to the head and another in the side, and that did the business. We knew the body of Marie Badet had been found, and it was judged prudent to bury this new corpse. I ran to my house for the tools, and at the same time gave my wife the watch and the clothes, which were stained with blood. She asked where they'd come from. I didn't believe she'd believe me if I told her about the others, so I relied on her discretion and replied that they had belonged to a girl I had killed and was about to bury in Montmagny Wood. I then went back to my friends, who dug a shallow grave while I sat by. I must speak of Marie Eulalie Bousseau. I accosted her one day on the bridge La Griotière and asked her if she would accept a good place in the country, offering 200 francs. She required 210, and we went to her sister's house to discuss the matter. I agreed to her terms. At the end of a week, I returned and escorted her to the station at Brotteaux. My employers were there, and I introduced them to Marie Bousseau as friends and neighbors of mine who would accompany us to some distance. My employers were there, and I introduced them to Marie Bousseau as friends and neighbors of mine who would accompany us some distance after quitting the rail. It was dark when we reached Montléul, and I had to act as a guide, carrying the girl's trunk, as I so often did for these small women. "What a lovely creature," whispered one of my employers as we set out. I led the way towards a wild, retired spot, following a path towards Croix Martel. Here I hid the trunk among some bushes, assuring the girl I would return for it in the morning. At this point, my courage failed me. I told my friends I could go no further. In 2 hours, the men returned, bringing some clothes and a pair of gold earrings, which they gave me for my wife. I inquired what they had done with the girl. She got 2 blows on the head and 1 in the stomach. She made no great outcry. I went home for a spade, and the men buried her here, as you see. Marie Pichon would have suffered the same fate, but my 2 employers failed to meet us at the appointed place. I did not wish to do her any harm. On the contrary, finding the men absent, I wished to frighten her off. So I threw my arms around her neck. I was glad to see her run away. I thought that at least they wouldn't get her. Some days later I judged it prudent to destroy the effects of the girl Bousseau and those of Pichon, and buried them in the wood des Rouillons. Now I have told all. I have nothing more to add. Junot's staff searched the rivers for human remains, but found none. Marianne was still being questioned. The more she cast all the blame at Martin's feet, the more apparent it became that she knew far more details about the crime than she would have if he had kept it all secret from her. Junot ascertained from her that Martin may have murdered as many as 18 women. Martin continued to characterize Marianne as completely blameless and ignorant of his violent tendencies. The lies he told to cover up for her only served to convince the inquisitors that it was a cover-up. January 29th, 1862. Martin Dumoullard's trial began. Due to the 1862 equivalent of going viral, the case became a sensation throughout France. It attracted a full house of spectators in the courtroom, and the media lapped up every new tidbit of information that was made publicly available. Sure enough, when Dumollard took his place in the courtroom, spectators were heard saying, "There he is! There he is!" Marie-Anne was tried along with her husband. Her best efforts at throwing him under the bus only clarified what her role in the murders was. The judge, magistrate Marihat, made what was the most exact estimation of Martin Dumollard's character. You have no means, yet you do not work. You bear the character of a man at war with civilization. The complete list of Martin Dumollard's 12 victims. Marie Badet, murdered, end of February 1855. Olympe Oloubert, March 4th, 1855. Joseph T. Charletti, September 22nd, 1855. Jeanne Marie Bourgeois, October 31st, 1855. Victorine Perrin, November 1855. Unidentified woman in the woods of Montmartre, murdered, November or December 1855. Julie Fargiat, January 18th, 1859. Unidentified woman in the St. Croix Mill, December 11th, 1859. The Laborde daughter in the inn, February 1860. Louise Michel, April 30th, 1860. Marie Eulalie Bousseau, murdered, February 25th or 26th, 1861. Marie Pichon, attempted murder, May 26th, 1861. Though it was never proven, police strongly suspected that there could have been hundreds of victims. Dumollard was sui generis at the time in terms of being France's first serial killer, or at least the first to be identified and prosecuted. Marie-Anne was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Martin Dumollard was sentenced to death. He launched an appeal, but the sentence was upheld. When he was notified that he was to be killed using a guillotine, he said, "I like it better than to be like my father, quartered on a wheel, being pulled in all directions by horses." March 7th, 1862. Martin Dumollard was executed. Part 2. Sexual Violence in the Congo. The Democratic Republic of the Congo has been dubbed the rape capital of the world. It has also been designated as the most dangerous place in the world to be a woman by international monitoring agencies. The very nature of sexual violence in the Congo has been described as the worst in the world in terms of barbarity. Armed conflict has plagued the Congo throughout its history and has never entirely abated. In many cases, rape has become weaponized as part of war efforts. The rate of sexual violence has increased since armed conflicts that arose in the 1990s onward. Most of the sexual assault is committed in the eastern region of the country. Armed militias are highly represented among the offenders. Nevertheless, sexual violence occurs at epidemic proportions in other areas of the country and is not always correlated with conditions of war. The Congolese government has been a target for criticism for not doing enough to put an end to, or to at least reduce, the incidence of sexual violence. Rape is prohibited by the Congolese Criminal Code, but the laws are not always enforced. One quote regarding the laws that prohibit sexual violence. The law specifically prohibits and provides penalties of 10 to 20 years imprisonment for child and forced prostitution, pimping, and trafficking for sexual exploitation. There were no reported investigations or prosecutions of traffickers during the year 2007. Wilhelmine Ntakaboka manages a sexual violence program in the Congo. She has a theory about how the rate of sexual violence increased in the 1990s. The epidemic of rapes seems to have started in the mid-1990s. That coincides with the waves of Hutu militiamen who escaped into Congo's forests after exterminating 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus during Rwanda's genocide 13 years ago. Mr. Holmes said that while government troops might have raped thousands of women, the most vicious attacks had been carried out by Hutu militias. The rates of sexual violence continue to rise and fall as these conflicts come and go. Other issues that drive the wars that lead to weaponization of sexual violence are control of land, control of mining materials, and economic problems. Another factor driving the rates of sexual violence higher are myths and misconceptions regarding rape, like the notion that raping a prepubescent girl will endow the offender with strength in war or business negotiations. The widespread and constant incidence of sexual assault has gone on for so long that the population has become desensitized to it. It is usually foreign human rights advocates who react to the situation with alarm. As previously stated, Congo has been referred to as the most dangerous place on earth to be a woman. In October 2004, Amnesty International noted that 40,000 cases of rape were reported through the prior 6 years. In any country, rapes are underreported, but Congolese women face serious consequences from offenders for reporting these incidents. Estimates have it that there are a minimum of 200,000 rape survivors living in Congo. One 2011 report has it that 1,000 women were raped on a daily basis in Congo that year. The Journal of the American Medical Association concluded after extensive research in 2010 that 39.7% of women in the eastern region of Congo experienced sexual violence at some point in their lives, usually in the form of rape. Perhaps more disturbing is the feeling of entitlement the offenders feel regarding these crimes. Noel Rawin-Barimba, a 16-year-old child soldier with 2 years of experience, said, "If we see girls, it's our right. We can violate them." That quote reflects the normalization of sexual violence in Congo. Due to ongoing war, the patriarchs of households are frequently killed. Between 60 to 90% of women are left to provide for their families and must travel long distances to procure resources. This leaves them vulnerable to attacks. The following are the different categories of rape that occur in Congo. Punitive rape, used to punish to elicit silence and control. Status rape, occurring as a result of acknowledged differences in rank. Ceremonial rape, undertaken as part of socially sanctioned rituals. Exchange rape, when genital contact is used as a bargaining tool. Theft rape, involuntary abduction of individuals as slaves, prostitutes, concubines, or spoils of war. Survival rape, when women become involved with older men to secure goods needed to survive. It should be noted that civilians commit rape as well, and that females make up 41.1% of the perpetrators when women are assaulted, and 10% when males are abused. It is estimated that 4 out of 10 victims are male. These incidents go underreported, however, due to the victim's fears of being perceived as a homosexual or otherwise as a feminized individual. Dr. Margaret Agama, the Congo's United Nations Populations Fund representative, commented on the nature of rape committed by civilians. Initially, rape was used as a tool of war by all the belligerent forces involved in the country's recent conflicts. But now sexual violence is unfortunately not only perpetrated by armed factions, but also by ordinary people occupying positions of authority, neighbors, friends, and family members. Over 65% of victims over the past 15 years were children. Most were adolescent girls. 10% were under 10 years of age. Child soldiers recruited from refugee camps are frequently abused. Many of these children are forced into prostitution and are trafficked as far afield as Europe. Domestic violence. Article 444 of the Congo Family Code states that a wife, quote, owes her obedience to her husband. Marital rape is not a punishable offense in Congo. Congolese women do not have the right to refuse sex. Should they do so, their husbands have the legal right to discipline their wives, which has been dubbed by locals as, quote, tough love. Intimate partner violence occurs at a rate of 31% of women and 17% of men. Women rarely report these incidents because they have no legal rights to share property or finances with their husbands. They could even lose their children. They could also be shunned by the community. Many Congolese women are not even aware that it could or should be a punishable offense. Other sexual offenses that arise in the Congo during times of war include sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, gang rape, forced incest, sexual mutilation, disemboweling, genital mutilation, cannibalism, deliberate spread of HIV/AIDS, forced sterilization, forcing of crude objects such as tree branches and bottles into the vagina, public rape in front of the family and community, forced rape between victims, pouring melted rubber into the women's vaginas, shooting women in the vagina, inducing abortions using sharp objects. Women are typically blamed for rape in the Congo and are subjected to one or more of the previously stated punishments. As for the public rapes, they became so popular and frequent, they were given the name La Reine. It consists of women being stripped, tied upside down, and gang raped in the middle of their village. Consent to invade a village and rape its women is often presented as a reward to an armed militia by its commanders. The government's army, the FARDC, is represented more than any other group among the perpetrators. The victims tend to suffer serious consequences to their physical health. Among them, severed limbs, broken limbs, burned flesh, rectovaginal and vesicovaginal fistulas, STIs, pregnancy, urinary incontinence, death. Young girls in the earliest stages of their sexual development often become pregnant and suffer from severe complications like obstructed birth, which often leads to fistulas or even death. To quote one medical professional, on a young girl, a pelvis hasn't yet grown large enough to accommodate the baby's head, a common occurrence with young teenagers. These girls end up in obstructed birth, with the baby stuck inside their birth passages. Often they can't walk or stand, a consequence of nerve damage that is a frequent byproduct of fistulae. The problem is further complicated by the fact that medical attention is hard to come by in the region due to availability issues and financial limitations. Due to socio-cultural barriers and the influence of the Vatican, birth control and devices to prevent the transmission of STDs are not widely available. As a result, 20% of the population has HIV. Many of the women are victims of honor killings due to the perception that they were to blame for the attacks. Raped women are also perceived as being impure. In such case, they are abandoned by their husbands or are not considered to be marriage material. Psychological trauma frequently leads to depression, suicide, and other complications. This is particularly true when men have forced their victim into rape at gunpoint. Their victim could be a daughter, sister, or even their mother. No matter how young a female victim might be, she is thenceforth deemed to have crossed the threshold into adulthood. By the lights of Congolese society, rape is considered to be an, quote, act of marriage, unquote, to the offender. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.